For what purpose does the gentleman from Louisiana seek recognition?
Madam Speaker, I request to speak out of order to inquire to the Majority Leader the schedule for next week.
Objection.
And I also move to ask unanimous consent to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection.
And with that, I yield to the Majority Leader.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. On Tuesday, Madam Speaker, the House will meet at 12 p.m. for morning hour debate and 2 p.m. for legislative business, with votes postponed until 6:30 p.m. On Wednesday and Thursday, the House will meet at 10 a.m. for morning hour debate and 12 p.m. for legislative business. On Friday, the House will meet at 9 a.m. for legislative business. We will consider several bills under suspension of the rules. The complete list of suspension bills will be announced by the close of business tomorrow. The House will also consider H.R. 986, Protecting Americans with Pre-Existing Conditions Act of 2019. On October 22, 2018, the Trump administration continued the Republican assault on affordable quality health coverage by issuing new guidance to carry out Section 1332 of the Affordable Care Act. That new guidance, Madam Speaker, undermines patient protections and threatens coverage for Americans with pre-existing conditions. H.R. 986 blocks implementation of that guidance so as to preserve pre-existing condition protections and ensure that health care remains affordable and comprehensive. In addition, Madam Speaker, the House will consider H.R. 2157, Supplemental Appropriation Act of 2019. The legislation would provide relief and recovery assistance for Americans affected by recent natural disasters. It includes an additional $3 billion above that which we passed and sent to the Senate some weeks ago to address urgent needs following flooding in the Midwest and tornadoes in the South that have occurred since the House passed its first disaster relief bill in January, which unfortunately has languished in the Senate. Lastly, the bill includes an extension of the flood insurance program until September 30th, 2019. And I yield back to my friend.
Thank the gentleman for yielding back. I would point out that the President's executive order on Section 1332 does nothing to change the protections in law for people with pre-existing conditions. Under Obamacare, as the gentleman knows, the law protects people with pre-existing conditions from facing any kind of discrimination, and the Section 1332 waivers have nothing to do with that. What they do is allow some states, and there have been a number of states who have requested the ability to be more innovative and focus on lowering premiums while protecting pre-existing conditions. So those states that have taken advantage of that waiver have used it to, number one, provide health care in different ways, more innovative ways for their Medicaid population, which is something we should all encourage because Medicaid in many states is the worst form of health care. In many cases, doctors don't even take Medicaid policies and don't see Medicaid patients, so they can't get access to care. And these waivers are a way to help open up more access to care at lower costs in many cases while protecting pre-existing conditions. But with that said, when the gentleman laid out the schedule, I didn't see anything on the President's request for supplemental funding for the border crisis. And specifically, there was a $4.5 billion request that came down from the White House that requested additional funding to address this wave of people that are coming into our country illegally, and in many cases, they've run out of detention beds. They're overwhelming the system, and it's been reported very widely about that, and that's why the President made the $4.5 billion request. I wanted to ask the gentleman if that might be included in this supplemental for the disasters that we would surely like to see addressed, and I yield.
I appreciate the gentleman's comments. I won't respond to his initial comments. Obviously, we have a disagreement on the impact that the administration has had on pre-existing conditions and on the section that, which we are referring. But we'll have a full debate on that next week when we consider the bill. With respect to the gentleman's question as it relates to the President's proposal for supplemental funding for border security, which, by the way, was sent down yesterday, and is now being reviewed. The gentleman knows that we are strong supporters of border security, and we want to make sure that the border is also humane. Now, the gentleman did not mention, but I want to point out that in the bill that we adopted to fund the government that was shut down for 35 days, in the bill that we passed, there were $755 million for construction and technology at ports of entry, where most drugs come into the country illegally. We want to make sure those drugs stop. We want to have border infrastructure that allows for not only security, but checking people who are coming into the country to make sure they do not have illicit substance with them, either for their own use or for sale. In addition to that, we had $415 million for the Border Patrol and the customs agents, and for humanitarian relief, which obviously was anticipating the problem that currently confronts us, and to make sure that people who come across our border are treated humanely and with respect. In addition, there was $30.5 million for alternatives to detention family case management, which we think is important. And in addition to that, there was $500 million, $563 million for immigration judges to reduce the backlog of cases. And lastly, $500 million, again, $527 million to assist Central American countries, which has had a positive effect on reducing crime and violence, which is one of the major reasons that people are fleeing those countries, particularly the Northern Triangle countries, fleeing those countries and seeking asylum in the United States of America pursuant to American law. But we are reviewing. We want to make sure, as I said at the beginning, that our borders are secure and that we are treating people consistent with American law, not separating children from their families, which the President says he wants to perhaps renew that policy. We are vigorously opposed to that policy, and we think the President is wrong in citing previous administrations that separated children. They did so in very few instances, almost exclusively when they were concerned with the safety of the child because of the parents' actions towards the child. So I will tell the gentleman we are going to be reviewing the President's request very carefully. Ms. Roy Ballard, who chairs the committee, and Mr. Thompson, who chairs the Homeland Security Committee, both will be looking at it carefully, and we will be making recommendations in the near future as to the disposition of that proposal. And I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Of course, at the final end-of-year spending bill, we got a start on addressing the problem of border security. We had very intense negotiations, and the President laid out the multitude of things that need to be done to actually get full control over the border, which we do not have. That was a start, and as the gentleman knows, it surely hasn't stopped the flow of people who have been coming across, and especially these caravans, these organized caravans in the thousands per day, which is overwhelming our system. I wish it would stop. I wish we would address all of the interior security problems and magnet laws like catch and release and the asylum loopholes that are encouraging people to come here illegally and in many cases overwhelming our own system. But as the gentleman reviews that supplemental, hopefully we can come to an agreement on how to, at least in the interim, address the problem. But ultimately, long term, we need a solution, and we will continue to work on that. And I'll yield.
The gentleman will yield. The point of reciting the dollars that were included just some weeks ago to the administration is to point out that they had clearly significant sums with which to operate now, and we'll see what funds they need in the future. But I wanted to point out that we have not been negligent or sleeping with respect to both border security and the humanitarian treatment of those who come across our borders seeking asylum. So that, as I said, we will review it and see what a determination is made on what further resources are necessary.
And that debate will go on, and hopefully we can start addressing some of the long-term problems. I wanted to ask the gentleman finally about legislation to confront this BDS movement, major threat to our ally Israel, trying attempts to undermine their economy. There's legislation, and of course there's a bipartisan resolution, the Schneider-Zeldin legislation, which I strongly support, which at least calls out the BDS movement. But as we've also seen, we actually need teeth. We need real tools that we can provide, not just our friend Israel, but also states, many states that are also trying to confront this problem and push back against the BDS movement. And the McCall bill addresses that, similar to a Senate bill that passed with over 70 votes, very bipartisan. And in fact, I believe there's legislation, there's amendments being put together to make the McCall bill identical to the Senate bill. And then the question is, can we get some kind of commitment, and I know we've talked about this before, to bring that bill to the floor so that we can finally truly confront this problem, this growing problem of BDS movement across not only the nation but within our country, and do it with real teeth like the bipartisan McCall bill. And I yield.
As the gentleman knows, and I thank him for his observation, Madam Speaker, the bill to which he refers has essentially four parts. A memorandum of the provision with reference to the MOU for Israel assistance package, which we strongly support. We strongly support the levels of that. That was not controversial. Also, the Syria sanctions bill. Of course, we have passed the Syria sanctions bills, and we're working on other bills that relate to that. Unfortunately, they are being held up in the Senate by some Republican senators, and the Syria sanction bill has not been moved in the Senate, unfortunately. It also has the Jordan MOU, which is not controversial, and it has the Syria, Jordan, and the MOU. There are the three factors. One is controversial. It's controversial because whether or not it comports with the law, there have been a substantial number of state cases that have been ruled that state actions taking on this issue have been held not to be consistent with law and the Constitution. We're concerned about that because I share the gentleman's view. I am an opponent of the BDS movement. I think it harms one of our most important allies, and it is inconsistent with, I frankly think, the welfare of the people in Israel and, frankly, the Palestinians in the West Bank. But having said that, we are strong supporters of the resolution. That resolution is got bipartisan support, I think, and if it comes to the floor, it'll have bipartisan support. The gentleman indicated that, and we intend to come forward with that. But we are trying to work to make sure that other suggestions are consistent with law, and we may move with those as well. But we haven't made that determination yet, and I yield back.
No, I appreciate it. I understand that there hasn't been any determination yet, but there is a growing frustration that this needs to be addressed by the Congress. There's a move to initiate a discharge petition to get that bill brought to the floor, and so those discussions will continue. Hopefully we can address the problem of BDS not only in resolution but also in legislation that has teeth in law to help those states that want to confront it, and also to help in a bigger way our ally Israel. Final point is on the process that we've seen. Of course, this week, only one bill that came under a rule, but as far as amendments go, we've seen a growing trend towards shutting out Republican amendments. And if I can just go through with the gentleman, as we've looked in this Congress, as we are, of the amendments that have come out of the Rules Committee, 74% of those amendments were Democrat amendments, 14% were Republican amendments, and 12% were bipartisan. If I can compare to the last Congress, when we were in the majority, there were in fact more Democrat amendments than Republican amendments allowed. 45% of the amendments were Democrat, 38% were Republican in our Republican majority, and 17% were bipartisan. So when you compare last Congress, when we were in the majority, we actually let more Democrat amendments to the floor than Republican amendments. So far, we've seen a complete reversal of that, where our amendments have been shut out at a very high level, again, 74% to 14%. I would just ask if the gentleman can look at addressing this problem and try to bring some parity to the floor process as it relates to that disparity. And I'd yield.
I thank the gentleman for his comments. Of course, what the gentleman didn't say is the last Congress had the most closed rules of any Congress in which I've served, and had the most closed Congress that we've served in, according to outside observers. But Mr. McGovern, Chairman of the Rules Committee, there were 30 amendments available to this bill. I'm not sure how many were asked on the Democratic side or the Republican side, frankly. But having said that, there were Republican amendments made in order. And we intend, and Mr. McGovern, the Chairman of the Rules Committee, has said he intends to have as many amendments made in order as they believe consistent with getting our work done. So I would say to the gentleman, unlike the last Congress, I think you will see closed rules be very much the exception, while frankly they were very much the rule in the last Congress. But I take the gentleman's point, and I'll have discussions with Mr. McGovern. But as you know, and I know, he's one of the fairest members in this House, and we'll be trying to accommodate members. I will also say that the gentleman's statistics include the appropriations process, where there were a lot of amendments on both sides of the aisle. We have not gotten to the appropriation process. As you know, it's my intention that we get to the appropriation process and, frankly, try to conclude the appropriation process next month. And I'm sure there are going to be a lot of amendments on both sides, coming from both sides.
I hope when we get to that appropriations process that there would be open rules, as we did. And I guess the gentleman doesn't have to worry about your majority breaking the record of closed rules, because this week we only had one rule. And in fact, again, a modified rule where over 30 of our amendments were shut out. Hopefully more legislation starts moving through the process. When we look at last Congress, we passed over 34 rules, well, 50 rules, 50 rules last Congress. So far this Congress, only 34 rules. We actually had 30 bills signed into law at this point in the Congress, last Congress. 30 bills signed into law under our majority, only 16 signed into law here. So hopefully we see more productivity as well as more openness in that process. And I would yield.
Comments. I think that the viewers and the members of Congress are probably being glazed over right now with these numbers, but I will tell the gentleman, there was not a single open rule in the House that was presided over by Paul Ryan. Not one. Not one. Check your record. But as I say, Mr. McGovern has clearly said that we want to have amendments made in order so that both sides can get a fair hearing. And I think he's been doing that. I think he'll continue to do it. And I'll yield back the balance of my time if the gentleman is, I'm prepared to yield back if the gentleman.
Right. Well, as eyes are glazing over, for clarity, there were many rules where every single Democrat amendment was included. So if you want to call it a modified rule, closed rule for people watching, when Republicans and Democrats go to the Rules Committee to try to amend a bill, when every single Democrat amendment is allowed in, that is an open process. Today, for example, the only rule today, over 30 Republican amendments were shut out. Over 30 were shut out. So many times we had rules where every single Democrat amendment was allowed. In the last Congress, more Democrat amendments were allowed than Republican amendments. But this hopefully can get addressed and corrected, and maybe when we get to an appropriations process, it will be more fair in that regard. So I would yield if the gentleman has anything else.
At the risk of
the 5 people watching
left. I'm going to yield back the balance of my time.
And with that, look forward to next week, hopefully getting some of those things done. And with that, yield back the balance of my time as well, Madam Chair. Madam Speaker.